I think that some in the BBC now are getting very defensive. They're working out their conspiracy theories. They're attacking the people who have criticised the BBC rather than looking in the mirror and seeing, okay, what do we need to change?
Right now, let's return to the crisis at the BBC and speak to a former senior executive there who has become a prominent critic, in particular of the corporation's coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict. He is Danny Cohen, former controller of BBC One and director of BBC Television. Danny, I am sure you have been watching the events of the last 24 hours with intense interest. What do you make of this double resignation?
Well, I think Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus have done the right thing by resigning. I think their positions had become untenable. I think this is not just about the doctored, manipulated Trump video. I think it's about what Mr. Prescott has said in his report and the detail in there around systemic bias across quite a wide range of subjects the BBC reports on. That includes Israel and the Hamas war, the American presidential election, gender ideology. So really that's what's going on here. And that's why this is such a significant concern for the BBC. It's not just about one programme, one edit.
Yeah, I mean, Samir Shah, the chairman of the board, has written a response today. It's quite long, 4 pages. He apologises for that Trump edit in the Panorama show, but he also points out that the BBC has taken many actions, he says, over recent months, indeed going back years, he says, to address some of the issues that Mr. Prescott alludes to. And there is a sense inside the BBC that there's something deeply political going on here, not least on the board of the BBC, which stopped, it seems, senior executives apologising for that Trump edit for many, many days, making the situation even worse for the BBC. Some talk of a coup. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that some in the BBC now are getting very defensive. They're working out their conspiracy theories. They're attacking the people who have criticised the BBC rather than looking in the mirror and seeing, okay, what do we need to change?
Yeah, but isn't one of the problems here that some of the people attacking the BBC are yelling and shouting and demanding impartiality, but they are not impartial actors themselves. They have a clear point of view, a clear personal opinion. So they don't really want impartiality. They want a BBC that sounds more like them.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think we should all have high standards we expect of the BBC. I saw your interview earlier where you were calling for the very same thing, and that you felt that there were some significant problems that needed to be addressed.
Yes, significant problems and errors are different from what you've called systemic bias.
They are, yes. Okay, so let me give you the example of BBC Arabic. If you've read that section of the report on the BBC, you will see that David Grossman, probably a man you know well, and I imagine you might respect, detailed a great deal of evidence of systemic bias at the BBC. People who had celebrated the 7th of October massacre, who had called for Jews to be treated in the way that Hitler did, appearing literally hundreds of times on the channel. They knew that. They had the evidence of that systemic bias. They chose not to make that public. In fact, the opposite. In meetings, in public, in private meetings with members of the Jewish community, they denied there was a problem of systemic bias and said it was just a few bad apples that they were dealing with. So yes, I think there's very clear evidence in the Prescott report of systemic bias. And I think it's also very clear that the BBC and its executives did not communicate that reality to members of the Jewish community who were criticising the BBC.
Yeah, Samir Shah makes a point of saying that issues inside the Arabic service have been addressed and real structural changes have been made. But I'm sure you are also aware that there are many media analysts who've looked at what the BBC has reported on the Israel-Gaza conflict and have concluded that, if anything, there is bias going the other way, that there is a bias against the Palestinians and toward Israel. One piece of analysis of 35,000 pieces of BBC content found that Israeli deaths, for example, were given 33 times more coverage per fatality than Palestinian deaths. Now, it comes back to my point. You may have your own particular point of view, but when you call for impartiality and fact-based journalism, are you sure that you really want impartiality?
I do, yeah, because I think it's the safest way of maintaining the future of the BBC. And if you look across the range of those issues, gender ideology, the American presidential election coverage, the Hamas-Israel war, the same pattern emerges over and over again. So yes, I do. I worked like you for many years at the BBC. I was very proud to work there. I know it's full of very hardworking people, but I think it does fall victim to institutional groupthink.
Let's talk a little bit about
Sorry,
process.
do you mind me finishing my sentence, Stephen? I
Go on.
think, yeah, thank you. I think it does fall victim to institutional groupthink and liberal bias, and that the sooner the BBC can confront that, the sooner it can get its house in order and be really fit for the future.
Let me just talk a little bit about process, because it actually is really important. Some of the big errors, and Samir Shah's now fessing up to a big error with the edit of the Trump speech. Some of these errors occur when the BBC farms out production of key pieces of content to outside independent producers. Is one of the key problems here. The BBC is doing too much of that and doesn't have the oversight and process systems to ensure that its editorial standards are absolutely imposed and integral to the content that is made from outside.
No, I think that's another get out that BBC managers would like to propose to blame people outside the BBC. It was BBC managers who were broadcasting from Glastonbury when Bob Villan ranted death threats and told an awful story about a Zionist. It was BBC executives who have overseen BBC Arabic. So no, I think that's a cop-out and a way of BBC executives evading responsibility.
I mean, it sounds to me, it's quite a while since you left the BBC. You seem to now think the BBC is entirely rotten.
No, I don't. I use it like you every day, but I think on some of these issues, it's time that the BBC confronted them, and actually very healthy if they confronted them and got better. I've talked to you about very specific issues. I'm not talking to you about BBC Sport or BBC Entertainment or anything else, but I think there is a problem with groupthink in the newsroom. I'm not the only person to recognise it. And if it can be addressed, it will be better for the BBC. There was a really interesting tweet last night, I thought, from Baroness Stowell, who said that the BBC feels that if it admits it's got a problem, I'm paraphrasing her, so forgive me for that. If it admits the BBC's got a problem, then its credibility will be affected. But actually, the fact that it won't admit it's got a problem is what's damaging its credibility.
Right. Let's briefly, Danny, let's look to the future and to who might take over the job. Everybody seems to agree it is an incredibly difficult job running the BBC, because you're responsible for news, you're responsible for entertaining the British public with shows like Strictly and a whole host of others. You're responsible for sport, for local radio, online, everything. Is it a job you'd like to do?
No, thanks. It's definitely not a job I'm planning to apply for.
But in a way, that answer's interesting, because if you, as a respected and veteran media executive, are not interested in running the BBC, what kind of person do you hope and believe would be interested in running the BBC? And do you think that ultimately, because news is at the core of what the BBC offers, it should be a robust, a confident journalist?
Yeah, listen, I've got my personal reasons for not being interested in that job. For me personally, it's too far from the creative side of the business, and I'm very happy doing what I want, doing what I'm doing at the moment. But yeah, I think it's a very difficult job, one of the most difficult jobs in broadcasting. I think it is better if it's someone with a journalism background, because I think part of the problem we've seen in recent months is the difficulty of having the kind of dialogue with leaders in news when they do get defensive. You'll have seen, we've seen from the Prescott report that even on the Trump clip, BBC News executives tried to defend it in meetings. And I think anyone who looks at that clip can patently see it's manipulated and gets Trump to say something he didn't actually say. So I think you need someone who can really get to grips with those issues.
Danny Cohen, thank you very much for joining us on The Times at One. Danny Cohen, former controller of BBC One there.